The Arizona desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, its red dust settling on everything like dried blood. In this unforgiving landscape, where hope withered faster than desert flowers, lived a man whose heart had turned as barren as the land he worked. But across those same burning plains rode another soul entirely, one who would soon discover that sometimes salvation comes not from above, but from the courage to act when witnessing unbearable cruelty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Sullivan stood in the shadow of his crumbling ranch house, surveying the wasteland that had once been his pride. At 48, he was a man hollowed out by failure, his face weathered not by honest work under the sun, but by the bitter winds of his own making. The Sullivan Ranch, inherited from his father and grandfather before him, now served as a monument to his incompetence. Broken fences sagging like defeated soldiers, empty corrals that hadn't held cattle in 2 years, and a main house with paint peeling away like old scabs. The drought had lasted 3 seasons, but Marcus knew his troubles ran deeper than any lack of rain. While his neighbors had adapted drilling deeper wells and switching to hardier stock, Marcus had chosen the bottle over the barn, the card table over the cattle. His wife, Sarah, had begged him to change, pleaded with him to think of their daughter. But Marcus had silenced her complaints with the back of his hand, one too many times. When pneumonia took Sarah that bitter winter, the town whispered it was grief that killed her as much as disease. Grace Sullivan, now 17 with her mother's gentle eyes and stubborn chin, had become the sole target of her father's rage. Every morning she woke to a house that reeked of whiskey and broken dreams, where the sound of her footsteps on loose floorboards might trigger another explosion of her father's fury. She had learned to move like a ghost through her own home, speaking only when spoken to, existing in the spaces between her father's attention. The ranch's debts had mounted like storm clouds on the horizon. Marcus owed money to the bank, to suppliers, to the men who had trusted him with cattle on credit. Most crushing of all was his debt to Vincent Blackwood, a wealthy landowner whose generosity had turned to menace when payment came due. Blackwood owned half the county and had his fingers in every pot from cattle to politics. He was not a man to cross, and certainly not one to owe money to for very long. Grace tended to the few remaining animals with the dedication her father had abandoned. She rose before dawn to milk their last cow, gathered eggs from the handful of chickens that scratched in the dirt behind the house, and maintained a small vegetable garden that kept them from complete starvation. Her hands, once soft like her mother's, had grown calloused and strong. Her spirit, though battered, remained unbroken in ways that would have surprised anyone who saw only her quiet demeanor and downcast eyes. The town of Copper Ridge lay 15 miles east, connected to the Sullivan Ranch by a dirt road that seemed to grow longer with each passing month. Marcus made the journey less and less frequently, knowing that every face he encountered carried either pity or contempt. Grace accompanied him only when absolutely necessary, preferring the isolation of the ranch to the whispered comments and sideways glances of the townspeople who remembered her mother and wondered how such a sweet woman had produced such a bitter man and such a silent daughter. On the rare occasions when Grace did venture into town, she moved with the careful steps of someone who had learned that drawing attention meant inviting trouble. She kept her head down at the general store, spoke only to ask for prices, and hurried through her errands as quickly as possible. The bruises on her arms, usually hidden beneath long sleeves even in the desert heat, told a story she had never spoken aloud to anyone. Dr. Matthew Reynolds, the town physician who had treated her mother in those final weeks, sometimes caught Grace's eye during these visits. He saw things others missed, the way she favored her left side when she thought no one was looking, the careful way she sat to avoid putting pressure on her back, the haunted quality that had crept into her gaze over the months since her mother's death. But Grace always looked away quickly, and Dr. Reynolds knew better than to ask questions that might make things worse for her at home. The creditors had begun circling like vultures. First came polite letters, then stern warnings, then visits from men with hard faces and harder reputations. Marcus met each escalation with bluster and promises, but everyone could see the desperation growing behind his bloodshot eyes. He had sold everything of value: his father's watch, his wife's jewelry, even his grandfather's prized hunting rifle. The only things left were the land itself and Grace. Vincent Blackwood arrived on a Tuesday morning in late summer, driving up to the ranch house in a black automobile that looked grotesquely out of place against the backdrop of rural decay. He was a man in his 50s, impeccably dressed despite the heat, with silver hair slicked back and cold blue eyes that missed nothing. His presence seemed to make the very air around the ranch house feel heavier, more oppressive. Grace watched from the kitchen window as her father stumbled out to meet Blackwood, his clothes wrinkled from sleeping in them, his face unshaven and haggard. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she could read the body language clearly enough. Her father gesticulated wildly, his hands shaking with desperation. Blackwood stood perfectly still, unmoved by whatever pleas Marcus was making. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, and when it ended, Grace saw something in her father's face that frightened her more than his anger ever had. It was the look of a man who had just made a deal with the devil and found the terms acceptable. Blackwood climbed back into his automobile and drove away without so much as glancing toward the house, but Grace felt as though those cold blue eyes had somehow found her anyway. That evening, Marcus drank more heavily than usual, which Grace had not thought possible. He sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of cheap whiskey, muttering to himself and occasionally glancing at Grace with an expression she couldn't read. There was something calculating in his gaze, something that made her skin crawl. She went to bed early, locking her bedroom door, a precaution she had learned to take months ago. She woke before dawn, as always, but something felt different. The house was too quiet, even by their standards. Usually she could hear her father snoring, off his drunk, or the creaking of the house as he stumbled to the bathroom. This morning there was nothing but the sound of wind through the broken shutters and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Grace dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, where she found her father already awake and dressed, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and an expression of grim determination. This was unusual enough to make her pause in the doorway, uncertain whether to enter or retreat. "Grace," he said without looking at her, his voice rough but steadier than it had been in weeks. "We need to talk." The words sent ice through her veins. In her experience, nothing good ever came from conversations that began this way. She remained in the doorway, ready to run if necessary, though she knew there was nowhere to go. "Come here, girl. Sit down." Grace moved slowly to the chair, across from him, every instinct screaming at her to flee. Up close, she could see that her father's hands were shaking despite his apparent calm, and there was something desperate and wild lurking behind his bloodshot eyes. "You know we're in trouble," he began, still not meeting her gaze. "The ranch is done, has been for a while now. Your mother, she tried to make me see sense, but I wasn't listening. Now it's too late." Grace said nothing, but her heart began to pound. She had known things were bad, but hearing her father admit it aloud made it feel suddenly terrifyingly real. "Blackwood came by yesterday. You saw him. He's been patient, more patient than I deserved, but his patience has run out. I owe him $23,000, Grace. 23,000. Might as well be 23 million for all the chance I have of paying it back." The number hit Grace like a physical blow. $23,000 was more money than she could even imagine. It was more than most people in Copper Ridge would see in a lifetime. But Blackwood, he's a businessman. He sees opportunities where other people see problems. And he's offered me a solution. A way to clear the debt and maybe even keep the ranch. Grace felt something cold and terrible unfurling in her stomach. Her father's tone, the way he still wouldn't look at her directly, the desperate gleam in his eyes, all of it pointed toward something unspeakable. He's offered to take you off my hands, Grace. Marry you proper, make you his wife. You'd live in his big house in town, have everything you could want. Fine clothes, good food, servants to wait on you, and in return my debt disappears. The ranch stays in the family. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire, acrid and poisonous. Grace stared at her father, unable to process what she had just heard. Surely he couldn't be serious. Surely even he wouldn't sink this low. But the expression on his face told her everything she needed to know. He was serious, deadly serious. He had already made up his mind, had probably shaken hands on it with Blackwood yesterday while she watched from the kitchen window. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible. "What did you say?" "I said no." Her voice was stronger now, though her hands were shaking. "I won't do it. I won't marry him." Marcus's face darkened, and for a moment Grace saw the familiar rage building behind his eyes. But then something else took its place, something colder and more frightening than anger. "You don't have a choice in the matter, girl. This is business, adult business. You're 17 years old, which makes you old enough to marry and young enough to keep your mouth shut about it." "I won't," Grace repeated, standing up from the table. "You can't make me." Her father stood as well, and Grace saw him sway slightly. Still drunk from the night before, despite his attempts at sobriety. "I can, and I will. You think you have options here? You think you have somewhere to run? This is the middle of nowhere, Grace. You got no money, no family, no friends who'd take you in against Vincent Blackwood's wishes. And if you try to run, if you try to shame me by refusing this arrangement, I'll make sure you regret it for however long you have left." The threat was clear, and Grace knew her father well enough to know he meant every word. She had seen what his hands could do when his temper was up. She had felt it often enough to know that he wouldn't hesitate to hurt her. If she defied him in this, but something inside her had finally reached its breaking point. Maybe it was her mother's spirit, finally stirring to life after months of dormancy. Maybe it was simply the realization that some fates were worse than death. Whatever it was, Grace found herself shaking her head. "I'd rather die," she said simply. The slap came so fast she didn't see it coming. Her father's hand caught her across the face with enough force to send her stumbling backward into the wall. Stars exploded behind her eyes, and she tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. "Don't you ever say that again," Marcus snarled, grabbing her by the shoulders and shaking her roughly. "Don't you ever threaten me with that. Can I talk? You'll do what I tell you to do when I tell you to do it, and you'll be grateful for the opportunity." Grace said nothing, but the defiance in her eyes was unmistakable, even with blood trickling from the corner of her mouth, even with her father's fingers digging painfully into her shoulders. She refused to look away. "Blackwood's coming back. Tomorrow," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "He's bringing papers for you to sign and a preacher to make it legal. You're going to put on your mother's wedding dress. You're going to say the words, and you're going to smile while you do it. Because if you don't, if you embarrass me in front of that man, I promise you'll wish you'd never been born." He released her then, and Grace slumped against the wall, her legs suddenly too weak to support her properly. Her father turned away, reaching for his bottle again, the brief moment of determination already fading back into the familiar haze of alcohol and self-pity. Grace touched her fingers to her swollen cheek, feeling the heat radiating from the fresh bruise. Tomorrow. She had less than 24 hours before her life would be signed away like a piece of property. Less than a day before she would belong to Vincent Blackwood, a man old enough to be her father and cold enough to make the desert seem warm by comparison. That afternoon, while her father sat on the porch drinking and staring at nothing, Grace walked out to her mother's grave. The simple wooden cross had weathered badly in the year since the burial, and the mound of earth had settled and cracked under the relentless sun. Grace knelt beside it, placing her hand on the sun-baked soil. "Mama," she whispered, "I don't know what to do. I can't marry him. I won't, but I don't know how to get away." The wind picked up, stirring the dust around the grave and carrying with it the faint scent of sage and distant rain. For a moment, Grace could almost hear her mother's voice on the breeze, telling her to be strong, to hold on, that somehow things would work out. But when the wind died down, there was only silence and the harsh cry of a circling hawk. That evening, Grace sat in her room trying to think of options. She could run, but where would she go? The nearest town was 50 miles away, and she had no money for a stagecoach ticket. She could try to make it on foot, but the desert was unforgiving too, those unprepared for its dangers. She could throw herself on the mercy of the townspeople, but most of them owed favors to Vincent Blackwood in one form or another. As night fell, Grace made her decision. If she was going to run, it would have to be tonight. She had no clear plan, no destination in mind, but anything was better than the fate her father had arranged for her. She packed what little she owned into a small bundle, a change of clothes, her mother's Bible, the few coins she had managed to save from her rare trips to town. She waited until her father's snoring indicated he had drunk himself into his usual stupor, then crept quietly through the house toward the front door. Her hand was on the latch when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town. Grace froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was too late for casual visitors, too early for Blackwood's return. She pressed herself against the wall beside the window and peered out into the darkness. A single rider was approaching the house, moving at an easy pace that suggested confidence rather than urgency. As he drew closer, Grace could make out more details. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, sitting on his horse with the easy grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a well-worn hat, but something about his posture suggested strength and purpose. The rider stopped about 20 yards from the house and called out in a clear, carrying voice that somehow managed to be both respectful and commanding. "Hello, the house. Marcus Sullivan need to speak with you." Grace heard her father stumble awake, cursing and muttering as he made his way to the door. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, clutching her small bundle and trying to make herself invisible. Preparing and narrating this story took a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus opened the door, swaying slightly as he tried to focus on the stranger in his yard. "What do you want? It's past midnight." "Name's Jackson Hayes," the rider replied, dismounting with fluid grace. "I heard you might be having some financial difficulties. Thought maybe we could talk business." Even in the darkness, Grace could see her father straighten slightly at the mention of business. Marcus Sullivan might be a drunk and a failure, but he was always willing to listen to anyone who might offer him a way out of his troubles. "What kind of business?" Marcus asked, his voice wary but interested. Jackson Hayes stepped closer to the porch, and for the first time Grace got a clear look at his face in the lamplight spilling from the open door. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair visible beneath his hat and a face that spoke of both strength and kindness. There was something in his eyes, even from a distance, that reminded Grace of her mother, a warmth and humanity that seemed utterly foreign after so many months of living with her father's cold brutality, the kind that might solve your problems, With Vincent Blackwood, Hayes replied quietly. The kind that might give your daughter a choice in her own future. Grace's breath caught in her throat. Somehow, this stranger knew about her situation. Somehow, he had come here in the middle of the night specifically to help her. It seemed impossible, too good to be true, but the alternative was to accept that tomorrow she would become Vincent Blackwood's property. Her father looked suddenly sober, his eyes narrowing as he studied the stranger. I don't know what you think. You know, but I know a lot of things, Sullivan, Hayes interrupted, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge of steel. I know you owe Blackwood $23,000. I know you've agreed to sell your daughter to clear that debt. And I know that tomorrow, if nothing changes, that girl is going to disappear into Blackwood's house and probably never be seen again. Marcus stepped back, his hand moving instinctively toward the shotgun he kept beside the door. You threatening me, stranger? No threats, Hayes replied calmly. Just facts and an offer. I've got cash money, Sullivan, enough to pay off your debt and give you a fresh start. All I want in return is to make sure your daughter gets the choice you're planning to deny her. The two men stared at each other across the porch, and Grace held her breath, hardly daring to hope that salvation had just ridden out of the desert night. Grace pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the two men outside could hear it. Through the thin wood of the house, she strained to catch every word of the conversation that might determine her fate. Jackson Hayes stood in the lamplight like some figure from a dream, offering hope when she had given up believing such a thing existed. Her father's voice carried a mixture of suspicion and desperate interest. What kind of money are we talking about, Hayes? And what's your angle? Nobody rides out here in the middle of the night offering to solve strangers' problems out of the goodness of their heart. Jackson Hayes removed his hat, running a hand through dark hair that caught the golden light. Grace could see his face more clearly now, and what she saw there gave her the first real hope she had felt in months. There was something honest in his features, something decent that seemed as foreign in her world as water in the desert. $25,000. Hayes said simply. Cash money. More than enough to pay off Blackwood and give you a stake to start over somewhere else, if that's what you want. Marcus swayed on his feet, whether from shock or lingering alcohol. Grace couldn't tell. 25,000. That's more than this whole place is worth. What's the catch? No catch. Just conditions. The money goes directly to Blackwood. To clear your debt. Your daughter stays here on the ranch with me as her guardian until she comes of age. She gets to choose her own future, her own husband if and when she wants one. And you disappear from her life permanently. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Grace could hear her father's labored breathing, could almost hear the wheels turning in his whiskey-soaked brain as he tried to process this unexpected turn of events. You're talking about buying her yourself, Marcus said finally, his voice flat and accusing. Same thing Blackwood's doing, just with different terms. Hayes shook his head slowly. Not the same thing at all, Sullivan. Blackwood wants to own her, use her, break her down, until there's nothing left of who she is. I'm offering her protection, education, and most importantly, choice. When she turns 18, she can leave with my blessing and enough money to make her own way in the world, or she can stay if that's what she wants, but it'll be her decision. And what do you get out of it? Don't tell me this is charity. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving past Marcus to scan the dilapidated ranch buildings. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of old pain that Grace recognized all too well. I had a sister once. About your daughters. Age? Sweet girl, full of life and dreams. Our father was a lot like you, Sullivan. Weak man who thought his debts and failures gave him the right to use other people as bargaining chips. He sold her to settle a gambling debt when she was 16, married her off to a man 3 times her age, who beat her bloody every night for sport. Grace felt tears sting her eyes as Hayes continued, his voice steady but filled with quiet anguish. She lasted 2 years before she couldn't take any more. Found her hanging from the barn rafters on a cold morning in December. Left a note saying she was sorry she couldn't be strong enough to endure it. I was 18, working cattle drives to try to earn enough money to buy her freedom. Came home too late. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, but Hayes wasn't finished. I swore that day that if I ever had the chance to prevent another girl from suffering my sister's fate, I'd take it. I've made good money over the years, saved most of it because I never had much use for luxury. This is what I want to spend it on, Sullivan. This is how I honor my sister's memory. Grace found herself crying silently, moved by this stranger's story and overwhelmed by the possibility that someone might actually care enough to help her. She had begun to believe that such kindness didn't exist in the world, that she was destined to suffer alone until suffering finally broke her, as it had broken so many others. Her father cleared his throat roughly. That's a real sad story, Hayes, but it doesn't change the facts. The girl is my daughter, my responsibility. I'll decide what's best for her. Will you? Hayes's voice hardened. Because from where I stand, it looks like you've decided what's best for Marcus Sullivan. What's best for Grace doesn't seem to factor into your thinking at all. You don't know anything about my situation, about what I've been through. Losing my wife, watching this place fall apart, trying to hold everything together for that girl's sake. Stop! The word cracked like a whip, and Hayes stepped closer to the porch. Don't you dare claim you're doing this for her sake. Don't you insult my intelligence or your daughter's suffering by pretending this is anything other than exactly what it is. You're selling a 17-year-old girl to pay your gambling debts. Own it, Sullivan. At least have the decency to be honest about what you are. Marcus's face flushed with anger and shame. You got no right. I've got $25,000 that says I have every right. That's more rights than you've given your daughter in years. Hayes pulled a leather satchel from his saddlebags and set it on the porch with a heavy thud. It's all there. Count it if you want. More money than you'll see again in 3 lifetimes. Grace watched her father stare at the satchel with the naked hunger of a starving man looking at a feast. She could see the war playing out across his features. Greed battling with whatever small shred of paternal instinct might remain. Desperation wrestling with pride. What guarantee do I have that you'll treat her right? Marcus asked, though. His eyes never left the money. How do I know you're not just as bad as Blackwood, only better at hiding it? You don't, Hayes admitted. You'll have to take my word, same as I'm taking yours, that you'll honor our agreement and stay away from her. But here's the difference between my word and Vincent Blackwood's. I'm giving your daughter a choice. Right now. Tonight. Hayes raised, his voice slightly, addressing his words to the house itself. Grace Sullivan, I know you're listening. I know you can hear every word we're saying. This concerns you more than anyone else, so you should have a say in it. Grace's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever asked for her opinion about anything that mattered. The very idea that her voice might count for something seemed impossible. Come on out here, Grace, Hayes continued gently. Let's talk face to face. You deserve to know what your options are. Marcus spun around, his face darkening with rage. Grace, you get away from that door right now. This doesn't concern you. But something had shifted in Grace the moment Hayes acknowledged her right to be heard. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone was treating her like a person rather than property. The fear that had kept her silent and hidden for so long began to give way to something else. Not quite courage yet, but the seed of it. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch, still clutching her small bundle of belongings. In the lamplight, she could see Hayes's eyes widen slightly as he took in her appearance. The fresh bruise on her cheek, the careful way she held herself, the haunted quality that had settled over her features like dust over abandoned furniture. "Hello, Grace," Hayes said softly, removing his hat entirely. I'm Jackson Hayes. I'm sorry to meet you under these circumstances, but I wanted to give you a choice. Your father seems determined to deny you." Grace glanced at her father, whose face had gone purple with fury. She knew that look, knew it meant pain for her later if she defied him now. But Hayes had ridden out of the darkness, offering something she had never had before, agency over her own life. "What kind of choice?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hayes gestured to the satchel on the porch. "I've offered your father enough money to pay off his debts and start over somewhere else. In exchange, I'd like to serve as your guardian until you come of age. You'd live on my ranch, help with the work if you're willing, learn to read and write if you don't already know how. When you turn 18, you'd be free to go wherever you want with enough money to make your own way in the world." Grace stared at him, unable to quite believe what she was hearing. "And if I don't want to go, if I want to stay, then you stay. It would be your choice, always your choice." Marcus stepped between them, his face twisted with rage. "She's 17 years old. She doesn't get to make choices about her own life. That's what parents are for." "Parents," Hayes repeated, his voice heavy with disgust. "Is that what you call yourself? A parent protects their children, Sullivan. They sacrifice for them, fight for them, die for them if necessary. They don't sell them to pay gambling debts. How dare you? How dare I what? Tell the truth? Point out that you're about to destroy your daughter's life to save your own worthless." "Hide?" Hayes turned back to Grace, ignoring Marcus's sputtering fury. "What do you want, Grace? If you could choose your own path, what would it be?" Grace looked into Hayes's eyes and saw something she had almost forgotten existed, genuine concern for her well-being. Not what she could do for someone else, not how she could be used to solve someone else's problems, but actual care for her as a person with hopes and dreams and the right to pursue them. "I want to be free," she said, the words coming out stronger than she had expected. "I want to wake up in the morning without being afraid. I want to learn things, see things, maybe help other people the way you're trying to help me." "Then that's what you'll have," Hayes said simply. "You have my word." Marcus grabbed Grace's arm, his fingers digging into the flesh hard enough to leave bruises. "You ungrateful little—" Hayes moved faster than Grace had ever seen anyone move. One moment her father was gripping her arm, the next he was on his. Back on the porch with Hayes standing over him, his face hard as granite. "Touch her again, and I'll break your arm," Hayes said quietly. "In fact, touch her again, and you'll spend the rest of your short life regretting it." Marcus struggled to his feet, his hand moving toward the shotgun by the door. "This is my property, my house, my daughter. You got no right." Hayes's hand moved to the gun at his hip with casual confidence. "I wouldn't, Sullivan, I really wouldn't." Something in Hayes' tone must have penetrated Marcus's alcohol-fueled rage, because he froze with his hand halfway to the shotgun. For a long moment, the three of them stood in tense silence, the only sound the whisper of wind through the broken shutters. "Here's how this is going to work," Hayes said, his voice calm but implacable. "Grace is going to pack whatever belongings she wants to take with her. You're going to count that money and satisfy yourself that it's all there. Then you're going to saddle up and ride into town to wake up Vincent Blackwood and give him his money. By sunrise, Grace and I will be gone, and you'll never see either of us again." "And if I refuse?" Marcus asked, though the fight had gone out of his voice. "Then tomorrow Vincent Blackwood will come here expecting to collect his bride, and you'll have to explain to him why the deal fell through." How do you think that conversation will go, Sullivan? How do you think a man like Blackwood reacts when someone wastes his time and breaks their word? Grace saw her father's face go pale as the implications sank in. Vincent Blackwood was not a forgiving man, and he had a reputation for making examples of those who crossed him. If Marcus couldn't deliver Grace as promised, Blackwood would likely take the ranch, the remaining livestock, and probably Marcus's life as compensation. On the other hand, Hayes continued, you take my money, pay off your debt, and disappear. Start over somewhere else where nobody knows your name or your history. Maybe find a place where they don't have gambling halls and saloons on every corner. Maybe try being the man your wife thought she married. Marcus stared at the satchel for a long moment, then at Grace, then back at the money. Grace could see the exact moment when greed and self-preservation won out over whatever vestige of paternal feeling might have remained. Fine, he said, his voice hollow, but I want to count the money first, and I want your word that you'll treat her right. You'll have both, Hayes replied. Grace, go pack your things. Take whatever you want to remember your mother by, anything that has meaning for you. We'll be leaving as soon as your father's business in town is finished. Grace nodded and turned toward the house, then paused. Mr. Hayes, thank you. I don't know why you're doing this for me, but thank you. Hayes smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. Everyone deserves a chance to choose their own path, Grace. That's all I'm giving you, a chance. As Grace gathered her few possessions, she could hear her father and Hayes negotiating the details of their arrangement. Marcus would take the money to Blackwood immediately, explaining that he had found an alternative solution to his debt problem. Blackwood might be angry about losing his intended bride, but $23,000 in cash would go a long way toward soothing his wounded pride. Grace packed quickly, her mother's Bible and wedding ring, a few pieces of clothing, a small wooden horse her father had carved for her years ago, when he was still capable of kindness. Everything that mattered to her fit easily into a single carpet bag. When she emerged from the house, she found Hayes saddling a second horse, a gentle-looking mare with kind eyes. I brought her for you, he explained. Figured you might want your own mount. Marcus was already mounted on his own horse, the satchel of money secured to his saddle. He looked down at Grace with an expression she couldn't read, part relief, part regret, part something that might have been love if she squinted hard enough and ignored everything that had come before. Grace, he said, his voice unusually soft. Your mother. She would have wanted better for you than this. I hope you know that. Grace looked up at the man who had been both her father and her tormentor, who had loved her mother and destroyed their family, who had just sold her to pay his debts, but might actually believe he was saving her. She felt no anger, no sadness, no fear, only a strange sense of closure. I know, Pa, she said quietly. Maybe now you can find your way back to being the man she fell in love with. Marcus nodded once, then spurred his horse toward town without looking back. Grace watched until he disappeared into the darkness, then turned to find Hayes watching her with concern. Are you all right? He asked. Grace considered the question seriously. Was she all right? She was leaving the only home she had ever known with a man she had met an hour ago. She was trusting her future to someone whose story might be complete fiction, whose motives might be far darker than they appeared. She had no guarantee that her life would be better, no promise that she wouldn't simply be trading one form of captivity for another. But for the first time in over a year, she had made a choice. For the first time since her mother's death, someone had asked what she wanted and actually listened to her answer. Whatever came next, it would be something she had chosen rather than something that had been forced upon her. Yes, she said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. I think I am. Hayes helped her mount the mare, his touch gentle and respectful. As they rode away from the Sullivan Ranch, Grace looked back once at the crumbling buildings and broken fences that had been her prison for so long. In the distance, she could see her mother's grave, a pale smudge in the starlight. Goodbye, Mama, she whispered. I'm going to be all right now. I'm finally going to be free. The desert stretched out before them, vast and mysterious under the star-filled sky. Hayes rode beside her in comfortable silence, letting her process the enormity of what had just happened. Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in so long she had almost forgotten what it was called. Hope. Behind them, the lights of the Sullivan Ranch faded into darkness. Ahead lay uncertainty, possibility, and the promise of a future she would choose for herself. As they rode through the cool desert night, Grace began to believe that perhaps her mother's spirit had been listening after all, had somehow sent Jackson Hayes to answer her desperate prayer for salvation. The worst was behind her now. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them as a free person with someone who actually cared about her well-being standing beside her. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Grace Sullivan smiled as she rode toward her new life. In the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, its voice carrying across the desert like a song of freedom. Grace listened to that wild, untamed sound and felt an answering wildness stirring in her own heart. She was no longer property to be sold, no longer a burden to be endured. She was Grace Sullivan, and she was finally, truly free. The Hayes Ranch appeared at dawn like a mirage, materializing from the desert heat. But unlike the broken dreams of the Sullivan property, this vision proved solid and real. Grace had dozed fitfully in the saddle during the long ride, jerking awake periodically to find Jackson Hayes still riding steadily beside her, his presence a constant reassurance that the night's events hadn't been an elaborate dream. As the sun painted the eastern mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Grace got her first clear look at what would be her new home. The Hayes Ranch sprawled across a natural valley where underground springs fed cottonwood trees and created patches of genuine green grass, a stark contrast to the sun-baked wasteland she had left behind. The main house was built of adobe and timber, designed to stay cool in summer and warm in winter, with a wide porch that promised shade and rest. "Welcome to the Circle H," Hayes said quietly, noticing her wide-eyed examination of the property. "It's not much compared to some of the big spreads, but it's honest land bought with honest money." Grace counted at least 50 head of cattle grazing in pastures enclosed by well-maintained fences. She saw a barn that actually had all its walls intact, a bunkhouse for hired hands, and several outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and careful management. Most importantly, she saw signs of life and activity: horses in the corrals, chickens scratching in a proper coop, even what looked like a vegetable garden behind the main house. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. After years of watching her father's ranch crumble around them, the sight of a working, thriving operation filled her with something approaching awe. Hayes dismounted near the main house and moved to help Grace down from her mare. His touch was gentle but impersonal, the courtesy of a man who understood that trust was something to be earned rather than demanded. Grace's legs were shaky from the long ride, and she gratefully accepted his steadying hand. "Jackson, that you?" The voice came from the direction of the bunkhouse, and Grace turned to see a weathered man in his 60s approaching them. He had the bow-legged walk of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle, and his face bore the deep lines that came from decades of squinting into the sun. "Morning, Ben," Hayes replied. "Grace, I'd like you to meet Ben Morrison. Ben's been a foreman here since before I bought the place, and he's the man who taught me everything I know about running cattle." Ben Morrison removed his hat, revealing silver hair that caught the morning light. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, despite his age, took in Grace's appearance with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to reading people and situations. "Pleased to meet you, miss," he said formally, but Grace caught the questioning look he shot toward Hayes. "Grace will be staying with us indefinitely," Hayes explained. "She's had some trouble with her family situation, and she needs a safe place to land while she figures out her next steps." Ben nodded slowly, and Grace sensed that while he might not know the specific details, he understood the general nature of her circumstances. "Well then, miss, welcome to the Circle H. It's a good place for folks who need a fresh start." The simple acceptance in his words brought unexpected tears to Grace's eyes. She had braced herself for questions, suspicion, perhaps even hostility. Instead, she was being welcomed without judgment or demand for explanations she wasn't ready to give. Hayes led her toward the main house, carrying her carpetbag with the same care he might show a precious artifact. "The house has 4 bedrooms," he explained as they climbed the porch steps. "I use the master bedroom at the back, but you can have your choice of the others. There's one that faces east if you like to watch the sunrise, and another that stays." Cooler in the afternoon heat, the interior of the house was a revelation. Grace had grown accustomed to living in rooms where broken windows were patched with cardboard and furniture held together with hope and wire. Hayes' home was clean, well-maintained, and furnished with pieces that had been chosen for comfort, rather than show. Books lined shelves in the main room, more books than Grace had ever seen in one place outside of the town library. "Do you read?" Hayes asked, noticing her fascination with the collection. "Some," Grace admitted. "Mama taught me, but we didn't have many books at home." "Well, you're welcome to any of these. I'm partial to adventure stories myself, but there's a bit of everything. History, poetry, even some novels written by women. About women's lives. Might be you'd find those interesting." The casual assumption that she would want to continue learning, that her education mattered, was almost as overwhelming as the rescue itself. Grace ran her fingers along the spines of the books, marveling at the wealth of knowledge and stories at her fingertips. Hayes showed her to the east-facing bedroom, a bright, airy space with a real glass window and curtains that had clearly been chosen by someone with an eye for beauty as well as function. The bed was larger than any Grace had ever slept in, with a quilt that looked handmade and pillows that actually held their shape. "There's a washstand with fresh water and towels in the chest there," Hayes said, setting her carpetbag on a chair by the window. "Take all the time you need to settle in and clean up. When you're ready, come find me in the kitchen and we'll talk about how things work around here." Grace nodded, still overwhelmed by the simple luxury of privacy and cleanliness. Hayes started to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Grace, you don't owe me anything beyond common courtesy and whatever help you're comfortable giving around the ranch. This isn't a debt you need to work off or a favor you need to repay. You're here because everyone deserves safety and the chance to build their own life. Don't forget that." After he left, Grace sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process the magnitude of the change in her circumstances. 24 hours ago, she had been preparing to flee into the desert with nothing but the clothes on her back. Now she sat in a clean, comfortable room, in a house where she was welcome, where her presence was valued rather than merely tolerated. She unpacked her few belongings, placing her mother's Bible on the bedside table and hanging her extra dress in a wardrobe that could have held 10 times as many clothes. The wooden horse her father had carved went on the windowsill where the morning light would touch it, a reminder of the man he had been before drink and failure had consumed him. The washstand held clean, cold water and real soap that smelled of lavender. Grace had not had a proper wash in weeks, and the simple act of cleaning away the dust and grime of travel felt like shedding an old skin. She braided her damp hair and put on her least worn dress, then studied herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The face that looked back at her was still marked by the bruise her father had given her, still bore the thin, hollow-cheeked look of someone who had not been eating regularly. But there was something different in her eyes, something that hadn't been there when she woke up yesterday morning. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just the absence of the constant fear that had become so familiar she had almost stopped noticing it. When Grace emerged from her room, she followed the sound of voices and the smell of cooking food to the kitchen. She found Hayes standing at a large wood stove, expertly managing what looked like enough breakfast to feed a small army. Ben Morrison sat at a rough wooden table, drinking coffee from a tin cup and watching his employer with obvious amusement. "Boy," "It cooks like he's still feeding a bunkhouse full of cowboys," Ben said to Grace as she hesitated in the doorway. "Course, most mornings he is, but today it's just us three and whatever hands decide to wander up for a free meal." Hayes looked up from the stove, his face brightening when he saw Grace. "How'd you sleep? I know it's been a long night, but I thought you might be hungry." Grace realized that she was, in fact, desperately hungry. The constant stress of her home situation had killed her appetite for months, but the safety of the Circle H seemed to have awakened all her suppressed physical needs at once. "I could eat," she admitted, and both men chuckled at the understatement. Hayes piled a plate high with eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, and fresh biscuits with honey. It was more food than Grace typically saw in a week, and she had to force herself to eat slowly rather than wolfing it down like a starving animal. "Ben's been telling me about the spring roundup," Hayes said as they ate. "We've got about 200 heads scattered across the range, and it's time to bring them in for branding and counting. It's hard work, but if you're interested, there's plenty you could help with. Nothing dangerous, mind you, mostly cooking for the crew and keeping track of the tallies." Grace nodded eagerly. The prospect of useful work, of contributing rather than merely surviving, appealed to her enormously. "I'd like that. I'm not afraid of hard work." "Figured as much," Ben said approvingly. "Takes backbone to survive what you've been through, and backbone's about the most useful thing a person can have out here." After breakfast, Hayes took Grace on a tour of the ranch operations. She met Maria Santos, a cheerful Mexican woman who served as cook and housekeeper when Hayes was hosting larger groups of workers. Maria took one look at Grace's too thin frame and immediately began planning ways to put meat on her bones. "Mija, you need feeding," she declared in accented English. "Good thing you come to the right place. Senor Hayes, he makes sure everyone eats well here." They visited the barn, where Grace met the ranch horses, a collection of sturdy, well-trained animals that clearly received excellent care. Hayes introduced her to each horse by name and personality, explaining which ones were good for beginners and which required more experienced handling. "This is Luna," he said, stopping before the stall of the gentle mare Grace had ridden from her father's ranch. "She's yours now, if you want her. Every person on a working ranch needs their own horse, someone they can trust and who trusts them." In return, Grace reached out to stroke Luna's soft nose, marveling at the idea of actually owning something so beautiful and valuable. At her father's ranch, she'd been lucky to get the use of whatever broken-down nag wasn't needed for essential work. The morning passed in a blur of new sights, sounds, and experiences. Grace met the ranch hands who worked for Hayes, a diverse group of men who treated their employer with obvious respect and who accepted Grace's presence without question or unwelcome attention. She learned about the daily routines that kept the ranch running, the seasonal cycles that governed ranch life, and the dozens of skills that would be useful for her to master. Through it all, Hayes remained patient and encouraging, answering her questions without making her feel ignorant, including her in conversations without putting her on the spot. He had a gift for making people feel valued, Grace realized, for seeing the potential in individuals rather than just their current limitations. As the sun reached its zenith, Hayes suggested they take a break from the tour. "There's something I want to show you," he said, leading her toward a path that wound up the hillside behind the main house. The path led to a small cemetery shaded by ancient oak trees. Grace counted perhaps a dozen graves, most marked with simple wooden crosses bearing names and dates carved with obvious care. Hayes stopped before one grave that was set slightly apart from the others, marked with a marble headstone that must have cost more than most ranch families saw in a year. "Rebecca Hayes," Grace read aloud, "beloved sister and daughter. She flew too soon to heaven's embrace." "My sister," Hayes said quietly. "I had her moved here after I bought the ranch. Couldn't stand the thought of her lying in that potter's field where they buried the poor and forgotten. She deserved better than that." Grace knelt beside the grave, moved by the obvious love and care that had gone into creating this peaceful resting place. "She would be proud of what you did for me," she said softly. "What you're doing." "I hope so. I built this place partly as a memorial to her, a place where people could find the safety and respect she never had. You're not the first person who's needed refuge here, Grace, and you probably won't be the last." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind in the oak leaves and the distant sounds of ranch life below. Grace felt a profound sense of peace settling over her, the first real calm she had experienced in longer than she could remember. "Mr. Hayes," she said finally, "what happens if my father changes his mind? What if he comes looking for me?" Hayes's expression hardened slightly. "He won't. I made it very clear what the consequences would be if he broke our agreement. And even if he did, Grace, he has no legal claim on you anymore. You're under my protection now, and I don't give up what's mine." The possessive note in his voice might have frightened Grace if she hadn't already seen so much evidence of his genuine care for her well-being. She understood that he wasn't claiming ownership of her person, but rather taking responsibility for her safety and future. What about Vincent Blackwood? He might be angry about losing his intended bride. Let him be angry. Blackwood's a businessman first and foremost. As long as his money gets paid, he'll find some other way to entertain himself. Men like him prefer easy targets, and you're not that anymore. As they walked back down the hill toward the ranch buildings, Grace felt the last of her fears beginning to subside. For the first time since her mother's death, she was part of something larger than mere survival. She had work to do, skills to learn, and a future to build. Most importantly, she had people who cared about her well-being and who would stand between her and anyone who tried to hurt her. The afternoon was spent in more practical pursuits. Maria Santos took Grace shopping for clothes and supplies, chattering constantly about the improvements they would make to Grace's appearance and health. Ben Morrison began teaching her the basics of horse care and ranch bookkeeping. Hayes himself spent time with her in his study, helping her select books to begin her expanded education. "Start with these," he suggested, handing her a collection of volumes. History, geography, some basic mathematics. If you're going to make your own way in the world, you'll need to understand how that world works. As evening approached, Grace found herself sitting on the front porch with Hayes and Ben, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The ranch was settling into its nighttime rhythms, and Grace felt herself settling too, the constant tension she had carried for so long finally beginning to ease. "Tomorrow we start the real work," Ben said, puffing on a pipe that smelled of cherry tobacco. "Roundup's hard business, but it's good to have purpose." Grace nodded, looking forward to the challenge. For too long her days had been filled with nothing but fear and endurance. The prospect of meaningful work, of contributing to something important, filled her with anticipation rather than dread. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Hayes stood and stretched. "Well, it's been a long day for all of us. Grace, you get a good night's sleep. Tomorrow starts your new life in earnest." Grace remained on the porch for a few minutes after the men had gone inside, marveling at the profound silence of the desert night. No angry voices, no sound of breaking furniture, no reason to lie awake, listening for footsteps that might signal a danger, just peace, safety, and the promise of tomorrow. When she finally went to her room, Grace knelt beside her bed and whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever force had sent Jackson Hayes into her life. Then she climbed between clean sheets and fell into the first truly restful sleep she had experienced in over a year, secure in the knowledge that she was finally, truly safe. Grace woke before dawn, her body still accustomed to the harsh schedules of her former life. For a moment, she lay disoriented in the comfortable bed, struggling to remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and she sat up with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. The rescue, the ride through the desert, the warm welcome at the Circle H. It all seemed too good to be true, like something from one of the adventure novels she had glimpsed on Hayes's shelves. The house was quiet except for the distant sounds of early morning ranch work beginning outside. Grace could hear horses nickering in the corrals and the low voices of men starting their day. She dressed quickly in her cleanest dress and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Maria Santos, already at work, preparing breakfast for what looked like a substantial crew. "Buenos dias, mija," Maria said cheerfully, barely looking up from the massive pot of coffee she was brewing. "You are an early bird, see? It is good. Ranch life starts when the rooster crows, not when the lazy bones feel like getting up." Grace smiled at the woman's directness. There was something refreshing about Maria's no-nonsense approach after years of walking on eggshells around her father's unpredictable moods. "Can I help with something?" "Aye, you want to help? Then you grab those eggs from the basket and start cracking. We feed 12 hungry cowboys this morning, plus Senor Hayes and old Ben. Take many eggs to fill those empty bellies." Grace threw herself into the work with enthusiasm, grateful to have something useful to do with her hands. As she cracked dozens of eggs into a large bowl, Maria kept up a steady stream of chatter about ranch life, the personalities of the various hands, and her own story of coming to work for Hayes 3 years earlier. "I was widowed, you understand," Maria explained as she mixed batter for what looked like enough biscuits to feed an army. "My husband, he was a good man, but not so good with the money. When he died, I had nothing, no family, no place to go. Senor Hayes, he hired me even though I could barely speak English, gave me a cottage behind the big house, good wages, respect. He is a good man, that one. You are lucky to find him." Grace nodded, understanding more than Maria might have guessed, about desperate circumstances and the life-changing power of unexpected kindness. "How did you meet him?" "I was in town trying to find work. Most people, they look at old Mexican woman and see nothing useful. But Senor Hayes, he was in the store buying supplies, and he heard me asking the storekeeper about jobs. The storekeeper, who was very rude, told me to go back where I came from. Senor Hayes, he stepped in, told that man that anyone willing to work deserved respect." Maria's eyes grew soft with the memory. "He asked me what kind of work I could do, and when I told him cooking and cleaning, he offered me a job right there. No questions about papers or where I came from, just, 'Can you start tomorrow?' That is the kind of man he is, Maja. He sees people, not just what they can do for him." The kitchen door opened, and Hayes himself appeared, his hair damp from washing and his clothes neat despite the early hour. He moved with the efficient energy of a man accustomed to making the most of every moment. But there was nothing hurried or frantic about his manner. "Morning, ladies," he said, pouring himself coffee from Maria's enormous pot. "Grace, I hope you slept well. I know yesterday was quite an adjustment." "Like a baby," Grace replied honestly. "I can't remember the last time I felt so safe." Hayes's expression grew serious for a moment. "That's how it should be. Everyone deserves to feel safe in their own home." He took a sip of coffee and visibly shifted to a more cheerful tone. "I was thinking if you're up for it, you might like to ride out with Ben and me today. We're checking on the south pasture, and it would be good for you to get familiar with the ranch boundaries." Grace felt a flutter of excitement at the prospect. She had always loved riding, though opportunities had been limited at her father's failing ranch. "I'd like that very much." "Good. We'll head out after breakfast. Ben's bringing along some of the newer hands, so you'll get to meet more of the crew. Fair warning, cowboys can be a rough bunch, but they're good men who know how to treat a lady with respect." True to his word, Hayes ensured that Grace was treated with nothing but courtesy by the ranch hands. When one of the younger cowboys made what might have been construed as a flirtatious comment, Ben Morrison shut it down with a single sharp look. and a quiet word about proper behavior around the boss's ward. The ride through the ranch gave Grace her first real sense of the scope of Hayes' operation. The Circle H covered thousands of acres of diverse terrain, rolling grasslands, rocky canyons, hidden valleys, where springs created oases of green in the desert landscape. Everywhere they went, Grace saw evidence of careful management and genuine prosperity. "Your father mentioned that ranching was hard work," Hayes said, as they paused on a ridge overlooking a herd of fat, healthy cattle. "He wasn't wrong about that. But he missed the most important part. It's hard work with a purpose. Every decision you make, every improvement you invest in, it builds something lasting, something you can be proud of." Grace studied the peaceful scene below them, trying to imagine what it would feel like to own something so substantial, so permanent. "How long did it take you to build all this?" 10 years of saving every penny, working cattle drives and mining camps, taking risks other men wouldn't take. "Another 5 years after I bought the land to really make it profitable." Hayes's voice carried pride, but also a note of something deeper. "I was motivated by more than just money, though. I had promises to keep, debts that couldn't be paid with. No cash." Grace understood he was talking about his sister again, about the vow he had made to prevent other young women from suffering her fate. It struck her that she was part of that promise, part of his way of honoring Rebecca's memory. The thought was both humbling and empowering. As they rode back toward the ranch house in the late afternoon, Grace felt a profound sense of belonging beginning to take root. The landscape that had seemed so foreign and intimidating just 24 hours earlier was starting to feel like home. The people who worked the Circle H were becoming individuals rather than strangers, each with their own stories and personalities. Most importantly, she was beginning to glimpse the person she might become in this new environment. Not the frightened, beaten-down girl who had swept porches and endured her father's rages, but someone with purpose and agency, someone who mattered. That evening, as Grace helped Maria clean up after dinner, the older woman studied her with shrewd eyes. "You look different already, Mika. Less like a scared rabbit, more like a young woman with her head up." Grace caught her reflection in the kitchen window and realized Maria was right. The constant tension had begun to leave her face, and there was something brighter in her eyes. "I feel different. Like I'm waking up from a long, bad dream." "Dreams end," Maria said wisely. "But what you do when you wake up, that is what matters. Senor Hayes, he has given you a chance to build a real life. What you make of it, that is up to you." As Grace prepared for her second night at the Circle H, she reflected on Maria's words. Hayes had indeed given her a chance, but she was beginning to understand that rescue was only the first step. Real freedom would come from what she chose to do with the opportunities now spread before her, like the vast desert sky, full of possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. 3 weeks had passed since Grace's arrival at the Circle H, and the spring roundup was in full swing. The ranch buzzed with constant activity as cowboys worked from dawn to dusk, gathering scattered cattle, separating calves from their mothers, and performing the dozens of tasks that kept a working ranch profitable. Grace had thrown herself into the work with an enthusiasm that surprised even herself, discovering talents and strengths she never knew she possessed. The morning sun was already hot when Grace emerged from the kitchen carrying a massive pot of coffee toward the branding pens. She had learned to balance the heavy vessel with practiced ease, no longer the uncertain girl who had arrived scared and broken just weeks before. Her movements had gained confidence, her shoulders had straightened, and the haunted look had begun to fade from her eyes. "Coffee's here!" she called out to the crew working the pens, and was rewarded with grateful nods and quick smiles from dust-covered men who had come to appreciate both her practical help and her cheerful presence. Jackson Hayes looked up from where he was examining a young bull, his face breaking into a smile when he saw Grace approaching. Over the past weeks, he had watched her transformation with something approaching wonder. The frightened, silent girl who had hidden in shadows was becoming a capable young woman who tackled every challenge with determination and grace. "Perfect timing," he said, accepting a cup of the strong brew. "We've got about 30 head left to process, and the boys are starting to drag." Grace surveyed the organized chaos of the branding operation with the eye of someone who had learned to read the rhythms of ranch work. Cowboys on horseback cut individual animals from the herd, while others worked on foot to wrestle calves to the ground for branding and marking. It was dangerous, demanding work that required split-second timing and absolute trust between partners. "Ben's been teaching me to read the brands," Grace said, pointing to a cow marked with an intricate symbol burned into her hide. "That one there is from the Morrison place, probably wandered over during the winter storms. We'll need to separate her. Out for return?" Hayes nodded approvingly. Grace's quick mind and attention to detail had made her invaluable during the roundup. She kept meticulous records of every animal processed, tracked which hands worked which sections, and somehow managed to remember the preferences and dietary restrictions of a crew that changed daily as neighbors pitched in to help with the massive undertaking. "You've got a natural head for this business," he told her. "Most people take years to develop the kind of instincts you're showing." Grace felt a warm glow of pride at his words. Praise had been so rare in her old life that she still felt surprised each time Hayes or one of the other hands complimented her work. But more than the praise itself, she treasured the growing sense that she was genuinely useful, that her contributions mattered to the success of the operation. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors in the form of Thomas and Catherine Mitchell, neighboring ranchers whose property bordered the Circle H to the east. Grace watched from the branding pens as the well-dressed couple approached Hayes, their expressions serious, despite their polite smiles. "Jackson," Thomas Mitchell called out, as he dismounted from a fine bay gelding. "Hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced. We were in the area checking our own stock and thought we'd stop to discuss a proposition with you." Hayes wiped his hands on a rag and walked over to greet the visitors, his manner friendly but cautious. Grace had learned that while Hayes was respected by his neighbors, the social dynamics of the ranching community were complex and sometimes fraught with tension over water rights, boundary disputes, and the inevitable competition for markets and resources. "Tom, Catherine, always good to see you," Hayes replied. "What kind of proposition are we talking about?" Catherine Mitchell, a handsome woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes, spoke up. "We've been watching your operation with considerable interest, Jackson. The efficiency of your roundup, the quality of your stock, the obvious prosperity of the Circle H. It's impressive." "We've been thinking," Thomas continued, "about the benefits of closer cooperation between our ranches. Shared resources, coordinated marketing, perhaps even some strategic partnerships that could benefit everyone involved." Grace continued her work, but kept one ear on the conversation, curious about these neighbors she had heard mentioned but never met. The Mitchells owned one of the largest spreads in the territory, and their good opinion could be valuable for Hayes's business and social standing. "I'm always interested in good business," Hayes said carefully. "What did you have in mind?" "Well," Catherine said, glancing toward Grace with barely concealed curiosity, "part of what we wanted to discuss involves the young lady we've heard you've taken in. We understand she's been quite helpful during your roundup." Grace felt a chill run down her spine at the woman's tone. There was something calculating in Catherine Mitchell's expression, something that reminded her uncomfortably of the way people had looked at her in the final days before her father's deal with Vincent Blackwood. Hayes's demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly, his friendly manner cooling by several degrees. "Grace has been invaluable, yes. She's got a real talent for ranch work." "That's wonderful to hear," Thomas said, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrents in the conversation. "We were wondering if you might be willing to loan her services to our operation for a few weeks. We're short-handed for our own roundup, and Catherine has been looking for someone to help manage the household side of things during the busy season." "Of course," Catherine added quickly, "we'd be happy to pay fair wages for her time, and it would be an excellent opportunity for her to gain broader experience in ranch management." Hayes was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from the Mitchells to Grace and back again. When he spoke, his voice was perfectly polite but carried an undertone of steel that Grace had learned to recognize. "I appreciate the offer, but Grace isn't available for loan or hire. She's not an employee here, she's family, and family doesn't get passed around between ranches like a piece of equipment." Catherine's face flushed slightly at the implied rebuke. "Of course, we didn't mean to suggest anything inappropriate. We simply thought it might be beneficial for a young woman to have exposure to different household management styles, particularly given her circumstances." The pause before circumstances was loaded with meaning, and Grace realized that her story, or at least a version of it, had made its way through the local gossip networks. She felt exposed and vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced since those first days at the Circle. Hayes stepped closer to the Mitchells, his posture radiating protective menace despite his continued polite tone. "Grace's circumstances are that she's a member of my household, under my protection, and not available for discussion or negotiation. I hope I'm making myself clear." Thomas Mitchell raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Absolutely clear. Jackson, we meant no offense. Perhaps we could discuss other forms of cooperation between our ranches another time." "Perhaps," Hayes agreed, but his tone suggested that such discussions were unlikely to be productive. After the Mitchells departed, Hayes found Grace cleaning equipment near the barn. She was scrubbing a branding iron with more force than necessary, her movements sharp with suppressed emotion. "You heard all that," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Hard not to," Grace replied without looking up. "They wanted to borrow me like I was a piece of machinery, pass me around to see how useful I might be." Hayes sat down on a nearby bale of hay, studying her carefully. "How did that make you feel?" Grace paused in her scrubbing, considering the question seriously. "Angry," she said finally, "and scared. For a minute there, I felt like I was back to being something that could be sold or traded without anyone asking what I wanted." "And what do you want, Grace?" The question caught her off guard with its directness. Over the past weeks, she had been so focused on proving herself useful, on earning her place at the Circle H, that she hadn't given much thought to her own desires and ambitions beyond simple survival and safety. "I want to stay here," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "I want to keep learning, keep getting stronger. I want to be part of something that matters, something that builds instead of just surviving day to day. I want to become someone my mother would be proud of." Hayes nodded slowly. "Then that's what you'll do. But Grace, I need you to understand something important. What happened just now with the Mitchells, that's going to happen again. Word has gotten around about your situation. And there are people who see a young woman without family as either an opportunity or a threat. You need to be prepared for that." Grace set down the branding iron and looked directly at Hayes. "What kind of threat could I possibly be?" "The kind that comes from being young, intelligent, and attractive in a community where single women with those qualities are rare. Some people will see you as competition for their daughters or as a potential disruption to their carefully ordered social hierarchies. Others will see you as Hayes's ward and assume that comes with certain expectations." Grace felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. "What kind of expectations?" "When would you need me to start?" Grace asked. "Today, if possible. James took a turn for the worse yesterday. Fever. Increased pain. I'm worried about infection setting in." Hayes looked deeply unhappy with the entire conversation. "Grace, I need to speak with you privately before you make any decisions." Dr. Reynolds nodded understandingly. Of course. I'll wait by my buggy while you two talk. Once they were alone, Hayes turned to Grace with obvious concern. Are you sure about this, going into town right now, when your father's been making noise about wanting to see you? It seems like unnecessarily risky timing. Grace had been thinking the same thing, but Dr. Reynolds' request had awakened something in her that she hadn't fully recognized before, a desire to use her newfound strength and skills to help others who were suffering. Maybe the timing isn't ideal, but that family needs help now, not when it's convenient for me. Grace, you don't understand what you're walking into. The Washington family. James is a former slave who came west after the war. His wife Mary is a freedwoman who worked as a seamstress before they married. They're good people, but they face prejudices that go far beyond what you've experienced. If you help them, some people will judge you for it. Grace met his gaze steadily. Some people already judge me for living here with you. Some people think I'm your mistress or your charity case or your temporary entertainment. I can't live my life trying to avoid other people's judgments, Jackson. If I did that, I'd never do anything meaningful at all. Hayes studied her face for a long moment, and Grace could see him processing her words, recognizing the strength and determination that had grown in her over the past weeks. You're right, he said finally, and I'm proud of you for wanting to help, but I'm still worried about your safety. Then come with me, Grace suggested. Dr. Reynolds would probably welcome an extra pair of hands, and you could make sure I'm protected while still letting me do something important. Hayes considered this, then nodded slowly. Actually, that's not a bad idea. I've been meaning to talk to James Washington about possibly hiring him once his leg heals. He has a reputation as an excellent carpenter, and we could use skilled help. With some building projects, Grace felt a warm glow of satisfaction at finding a solution that addressed both Hayes's concerns and her own desire to help. It was exactly the kind of collaborative problem-solving that characterized their best interactions, neither of them trying to control the other, but both working together toward a common goal. An hour later, Grace found herself riding toward town beside Hayes, her saddlebags packed with clothes for several days, and her mind focused on the challenge ahead. Dr. Reynolds had briefed her on James Washington's condition and the basic care he would need, but she was nervous about her ability to provide meaningful help to a family facing such serious difficulties. The Washington cabin sat on a small plot of land at the edge of town, surrounded by a carefully tended garden that spoke of hard work and pride despite limited resources. The building itself was simple but well constructed, with clean lines and solid craftsmanship that suggested James Washington's skills as a carpenter. Mary Washington met them at the door, and Grace was immediately struck by the woman's dignity. And Grace, despite the obvious strain she was under, Mary was perhaps 30, with intelligent eyes and calloused hands that spoke of long experience with hard work. Her manner toward Dr. Reynolds was grateful but reserved, and she studied Grace and Hayes with cautious curiosity. Mary, this is Grace Sullivan and Jackson Hayes, Dr. Reynolds explained. Grace has volunteered to help with James's care for a few days, and Mr. Hayes thought he might be able to discuss some work opportunities with your husband once he's recovered. Mary's eyes widened slightly at this news. That's very kind of you both, but we can't afford to pay. No payment expected. Or wanted, Grace said quickly. Dr. Reynolds says your husband needs help, and I have experience with caring for sick people. I'd like to help if you'll let me. Mary studied Grace's face for a long moment, as if trying to read her motivations and sincerity. Whatever she saw, there must have satisfied her, because she stepped back and invited them inside. The cabin's interior was spotless and organized, despite the obvious limitations of space and resources. James Washington lay on a narrow bed near the window, his left leg elevated and wrapped in bandages that couldn't quite hide the swelling and discoloration of a serious injury. He was a big man, probably in his mid-30s, with powerful shoulders and hands that spoke of years of physical labor. "James, these folks have come to help," Mary said softly. "This is Dr. Reynolds's friend Grace and Mr. Hayes, who owns the Circle H ranch." James struggled to sit up straighter, wincing with pain, but maintaining his dignity. "Pleased to meet you, both. Don't know what we've done to deserve such kindness from strangers." Hayes stepped forward. "Sometimes kindness doesn't need to be earned, Mr. Washington. Sometimes it just needs to be given. I understand you're a carpenter by trade?" "Yes, sir. Been working wood since I was old enough to hold a hammer. Did most of the finish work on the new bank building and the preacher's house before that." "Well, when you're back on your feet, I'd like to talk to you about some projects at my ranch. I'm planning to expand the main house and build a new bunkhouse, and I prefer to hire men who take pride in their work." James's eyes lit up with hope and gratitude. "That would be a blessing, Mr. Hayes, a real blessing." Grace spent the rest of the morning learning from Dr. Reynolds how to properly clean and dress James's wound, how to recognize signs of infection, and how to help him move around without putting dangerous stress on his healing leg. The work was challenging and sometimes unpleasant, but Grace found herself energized by the feeling of doing something genuinely useful for people who needed help. As Dr. Reynolds prepared to leave, he pulled Grace aside for a final word of instruction. "You have good instincts for this kind of work, Grace. Have you ever considered learning more formal nursing skills? There's a real need for competent medical care in this territory, especially for people who can't afford to pay much." Grace felt a flutter of excitement at the suggestion. The idea of having professional skills, of being able to support herself through meaningful work, appealed to her enormously. "How would I learn something like that?" "There are schools back east, but that would mean leaving Arizona. Alternatively, I could teach you myself if you're willing to work hard and study seriously. I'm not getting any younger, and I've been thinking about training someone to help with my practice." The offer was so unexpected and generous that Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "You would do that? Really? You have the temperament for it, and God knows this community needs more people who see healing the sick as a calling rather than just a way to make money. Think about it, Grace. We can discuss it more when this immediate crisis is over." As Hayes and Dr. Reynolds departed, leaving Grace to begin her vigil with the Washington family, she felt a profound sense of purpose settling over her. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it, a way to use her experiences with suffering to help alleviate the suffering of others, a way to turn her pain into something meaningful and productive. That evening, as she helped Mary prepare a simple dinner while keeping an eye on James's condition, Grace realized that she had found more than just safety at the Circle H. She had found the beginnings of a vocation, a path forward that would allow her to build a life of genuine significance. And perhaps most importantly, she had found the courage to extend the same kind of compassion to others that Jackson Hayes had shown to her. Grace had been caring for James Washington for 3 days when the storm clouds began gathering on the horizon, both literally and figuratively. The morning sky was heavy with the promise of rain, unusual for the late spring season. But it was the human storm approaching that would test everything she had learned about courage, loyalty, and standing up for what was right. She was in the Washington cabin, carefully changing James's bandages while Mary tended to their youngest child, when the sound of multiple horses approaching made them all freeze. Through the small window, Grace could see a group of 6 riders, approaching at a deliberate pace, their intentions unclear, but their presence somehow ominous in the growing gloom of the approaching storm. "Mary, take the children to the back room," James said quietly, struggling to sit up despite the pain in his leg. "Grace, you should probably—" "I'm not hiding," Grace said firmly, though her heart was pounding. "Whatever this is about, we'll—" Face it together. The lead rider dismounted and approached the cabin door with heavy, purposeful steps. When he knocked, the sound echoed through the small space like thunder. Grace opened the door to find herself face to face with Sheriff Amos Daniels, a man she recognized from her infrequent trips to town. Behind him stood 5 other men, including her father. Marcus Sullivan looked worse than Grace had ever seen him. His clothes were dirty and ill-fitting, his face was unshaven and haggard, and his eyes held the wild desperation of a man who had lost everything and blamed everyone but himself. When he saw Grace, his expression shifted between rage, relief, and something that might have been genuine paternal concern. "There she is," Marcus said, his voice slurred but determined. "There's my daughter, living in sin with strangers while her own father worries himself sick." Sheriff Daniels held up a hand to silence Marcus, then addressed Grace directly. "Miss Sullivan, your father has filed a complaint alleging that you were taken from his property against your will. He's asking the law to return you to his custody." Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. "I wasn't taken against my will, Sheriff. I chose to leave with Mr. Hayes because my father was planning to sell me in marriage to pay his gambling debts." "That's a lie," Marcus shouted, stepping forward aggressively. "I was arranging a beneficial marriage for your future security. You were too young and foolish to understand what was best for you." "Beneficial for whom?" Grace shot back, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "For me or for your debt to Vincent Blackwood?" Sheriff Daniels looked uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding before him. "Miss Sullivan, regardless of the circumstances that led to your departure, the fact remains that you're a minor and your father has legal rights. Unless you can prove that he was unfit or abusive." "I can prove it," Grace said, rolling up her sleeves to reveal the faded but still visible bruises on her arms. "And Dr. Reynolds can testify to the injuries he treated when my mother was alive. My father is a drunk and a violent man who sold me like livestock to pay his debts." One of the men behind the sheriff, whom Grace recognized as Deputy Williams, shifted uncomfortably. "Sheriff, maybe we should follow the law," interrupted a new voice. Vincent Blackwood emerged from behind the group of riders, his presence immediately changing the dynamics of the confrontation. He was impeccably dressed, despite the rough conditions, and his cold blue eyes fixed on Grace with predatory intensity. "Mr. Blackwood," Sheriff Daniels said with obvious unease, "I didn't expect to see you here. I have a vested interest in this situation," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Miss Sullivan was promised to me in marriage to settle her father's debts. When she disappeared, it cost me considerable inconvenience and social embarrassment. I believe I'm entitled to some form of compensation." Grace felt sick with revulsion and fear. "The debt was paid in full by Mr. Hayes. You have no claim on me." Blackwood's smile was cold and calculating. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong, my dear. Your father never had the legal right to transfer guardianship to Hayes without proper court approval. The money Hayes paid was essentially a bribe to steal you away from your lawful guardian. That makes Hayes a kidnapper and you an accomplice." The legal complexities were beyond Grace's understanding, but she could see the doubt and confusion spreading across Sheriff Daniels's face. Blackwood was a powerful man with political connections and expensive lawyers. His interpretation of the law would carry significant weight, regardless of its actual validity. "Furthermore," Blackwood continued, "I have witnesses who will testify that Miss Sullivan has been living in inappropriate circumstances at the Hayes Ranch. A young, unmarried woman residing alone with a bachelor rancher. The moral implications are clear." Grace felt her face burn with shame and anger. "Nothing inappropriate has happened. Mr. Hayes has been nothing but respectful and protective." "So you claim," Blackwood interrupted, "but the appearance of impropriety is often enough to ruin a young woman's reputation permanently. Of course, if you were to honor our original engagement, such rumors would quickly be forgotten. The trap was elegantly constructed and brutally effective. Blackwood was using both legal technicalities and social prejudices to force Grace into a corner where her only escape would be to submit to his control. The sheriff clearly didn't want to get caught between powerful interests, and her father was too weak and desperate to be counted on for support. "I won't marry you," Grace said firmly. "I'd rather face whatever consequences you think you can create than spend one day as your wife." Blackwood's expression darkened. "Then you'll face them. Sheriff Daniels, I'm formally requesting that you arrest Miss Sullivan for vagrancy and moral turpitude, and that you arrest Jackson Hayes for kidnapping and corruption of a minor." "Now wait just a minute," James Washington spoke up from his bed, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had faced worse threats than this and survived. "I've been listening to this conversation, and it seems to me that you gentlemen are awfully quick to make accusations without considering what the young lady actually wants." Blackwood turned his cold gaze on James. "This doesn't concern you, boy. Stay out of white folks' business." The racial slur hung in the air like a slap, and Grace saw James's wife Mary stiffen with anger and hurt. But James himself remained calm, his voice steady and dignified. "My name is James Washington, not boy, and this concerns anyone who believes in justice and the right of people to choose their own fate. Miss Grace has been nothing but kind and helpful to my family. She's shown more Christian charity in 3 days than most of your so-called respectable folks show in a lifetime." "You're out of line," Deputy Williams said, his hand moving to his gun. "Mr. Blackwood is a respected member of this community." "Respected by whom?" Grace found herself saying. "By people who think money and power give you the right to buy and sell human beings. By people who turn their backs on families in need because of the color of their skin." The confrontation was spiraling toward violence, and Grace could see that Sheriff Daniels was losing control of the situation. Marcus was getting more agitated by the minute. Blackwood was clearly prepared to use whatever force was necessary to get his way, and the deputies were following their boss's lead toward what looked like arrests and worse. Then the sound of rapidly approaching hoofbeats cut through the tension like a knife. Jackson Hayes appeared over the ridge at full gallop, followed closely by Ben Morrison and 3 of the Circle H ranch hands. They had clearly ridden hard to get here, and Hayes's face was thunderous as he took in the scene before him. "What's going on here?" Hayes demanded, dismounting and striding toward the group with deadly purpose. "Mr. Hayes," Sheriff Daniels said with obvious relief, "we were just discussing the legal status of Miss Sullivan's guardianship." "There's nothing to discuss," Hayes interrupted coldly. "Grace chose to come with me of her own free will. Her father accepted payment for transferring guardianship, and everything was done legally and above board." Blackwood stepped forward with his predatory smile. "Actually, Mr. Hayes, there are serious questions about the legality of your arrangement, questions that could result in criminal charges if not resolved satisfactorily." Hayes studied Blackwood for a long moment, then smiled with the expression that was far more dangerous than Blackwood's cold calculation. "Vincent, I was wondering when you'd show your true colors. This was never about the law or Grace's welfare. This is about your wounded pride and your desire to own something you can't buy." "I can buy anything, Hayes, including the judges and politicians who will decide Grace's fate if this goes to court." "Maybe," Hayes agreed, "but can you buy your way out of a grave?" The threat was delivered so quietly and matter-of-factly that it took a moment for its full impact to register. When it did, several hands moved to guns, and Grace realized they were seconds away from a shooting war that would likely end with multiple deaths. "Jackson, don't!" Grace said, stepping between him and Blackwood. "This isn't worth bloodshed." Hayes looked down at her, his expression softening slightly. "Grace, you are worth any amount of bloodshed. You're worth everything I have and everything I am. Don't ever doubt that." The simple declaration hit Grace like a physical blow, not just because of the words themselves, but because of the absolute conviction with which Hayes delivered them. This wasn't the protective affection of a guardian for his ward, or the charitable concern of a benefactor for his recipient. This was something deeper, more personal, more dangerous. "How touching," Blackwood said with obvious disgust. The corrupted maiden and her seducer declaring their illicit love for all the world to hear. Grace felt something snap inside her at the crude characterization of her relationship with Hayes. All the fear, all the uncertainty, all the anger at being treated like property instead of a person, crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. "You want to know what corruption looks like, Mr. Blackwood?" she said, her voice carrying across the assembled group with surprising authority. "Corruption is a grown man who thinks he can buy a 17-year-old girl to satisfy his twisted desires. Corruption is using the law as a weapon to force people into situations that benefit only yourself. Corruption is standing there in your fine clothes, talking about morality while you try to destroy good people who have done nothing wrong except refuse to be intimidated by your money and influence." Grace stepped closer to Blackwood, no longer caring about the danger or the social consequences of her defiance. "You think I'm afraid of you? You think I'm afraid of what people will say about me? I've been beaten, starved, and sold like cattle. I've nursed sick people that your respectable community won't even acknowledge as human beings. I've learned to shoot, to ride, to work with my hands and think with my mind. What exactly do you think you can do to me that's worse than what I've already survived?" The assembled men stared at Grace as if she had suddenly transformed into something entirely unexpected. Even Blackwood seemed momentarily taken aback by her fierce defiance. "I'll tell you what you're going to do," Grace continued. "You're going to get back on your horse and ride away from here. You're going to forget about whatever sick fantasies you had about forcing me into marriage. And you're going to leave the Washington family alone because they have enough troubles without dealing with your petty vindictiveness." "And if I refuse?" Blackwood asked, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Grace smiled, and there was something in that expression that reminded everyone present of Jackson Hayes at his most dangerous. "Then you'll discover that I'm not the helpless little girl you thought you were buying. I'm Grace Sullivan of the Circle H Ranch, and I'm under the protection of people who don't make empty threats." The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Rain began to fall in heavy drops, adding to the tension and discomfort of the situation. Finally, Sheriff Daniels cleared his throat. "Mr. Blackwood, I think maybe we should table this discussion for now. Let tempers cool down. Maybe get some legal opinions from folks who aren't personally involved in the situation." Blackwood looked around at the assembled faces. Hayes and his men ready for violence, Grace standing proud and defiant, even James Washington managing to project quiet dignity despite his injuries. Whatever he saw there convinced him that this was not the time or place for a final confrontation. "This isn't over," he said finally, "not by a long shot." "No," Hayes agreed quietly, "it's not. But the next time you come for her, Vincent, you'd better come prepared for war, because that's what you'll get." As Blackwood and his group rode away, Grace felt her knees suddenly go weak with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. Hayes caught her as she swayed, his strong arms steadying her against his chest. "You were magnificent," he murmured against her hair. "Absolutely magnificent." Grace looked up into his eyes and saw something there that made her breath catch. Not just admiration or gratitude, but something deeper and more complex. Something that matched the feelings she had been trying to suppress for weeks. "Jackson," she whispered, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how right it felt to be in his arms. "I know," he said softly. "I know this complicates everything, but Grace, I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just a protective concern. You've become everything to me, my reason for getting up in the morning, my hope for the future, my—" "Your what?" Grace asked when he stopped speaking. Hayes cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. "My heart. You've become my heart, Grace Sullivan. And I'll be damned if I'll let anyone take that away from me." The kiss that followed was soft and gentle, full of promise and possibility, rather than passion and demand. It was the kiss of a man who had found something precious and was determined to cherish it properly. When they finally broke apart, Grace felt as though the world had fundamentally changed around them. "What happens now?" she asked. Hayes smiled, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he looked truly relaxed. "Now we go home. We build the life we want together, and we prepare for whatever comes next, because you're right, this isn't over. But Grace, whatever happens, we'll face it together. As equals, as partners, as family," Grace finished. "The family we chose for ourselves." "Exactly," Hayes agreed. "The family we chose." As they prepared to leave the Washington cabin, Grace realized that the frightened girl who had swept porches and endured beatings was truly gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had found her voice, her strength, and her purpose. A woman who was ready to fight for the life and love she had discovered. The storm was far from over, but Grace Sullivan was no longer afraid of the lightning. As the rain began to fall in earnest, transforming the dusty ground around the Washington cabin into muddy rivulets, Grace found herself helping Mary pack essential supplies for James's continued care. The confrontation with Blackwood and her father had shaken everyone, but it had also crystallized something important. The Washington family was no longer safe in their isolated cabin, not with Blackwood's threats hanging over them. "You can't stay here," Hayes said to James as he examined the man's healing leg. "Blackwood's the type to take his frustration out on anyone he sees as connected to his humiliation. Your family needs protection until this situation is fully resolved." James struggled to sit up straighter, wincing with pain but maintaining his dignity. "Mr. Hayes, we appreciate everything you've done, but we can't ask you to take on more trouble on our account. You've got enough problems with that man already." "You're not asking," Hayes replied firmly. "I'm offering. The Circle H has a comfortable bunkhouse, and Maria would welcome help with cooking and household management once you're mobile again. Consider it a business arrangement. I need a skilled carpenter, and you need a safe place for your family to stay while you recover." Mary Washington looked between her husband and Hayes with obvious uncertainty. "Mr. Hayes, that's very generous, but people will talk. A Negro family living on your ranch, working alongside your regular hands. It could cause you social problems." Grace stepped forward, her voice steady and sure. "Let them talk. Anyone who would judge Mr. Hayes for helping good people in need isn't someone whose opinion matters anyway." Hayes nodded approvingly at Grace's words. "Besides, I've been thinking about expanding my operation anyway. James, I've heard you can not only build, but also teach others carpentry skills. I'd like to establish a training program for young men who want to learn a trade. Give them alternatives to cowboying or mining, skills they can use anywhere." The scope of Hayes's vision surprised even Grace. He wasn't just offering temporary shelter, he was proposing a fundamental expansion of the ranch's mission from simple cattle operation to something approaching a vocational school. "You're talking about changing your whole business model," Ben Morrison observed, having been quietly listening to the conversation. "That's a big risk, Jackson." "The biggest risks often lead to the biggest rewards," Hayes replied. "And besides, it's the right thing to do. There are too many young men in this territory with no prospects except dangerous, dead-end work. If we can give them skills and dignity, we strengthen the whole community." As they prepared for the journey back to the Circle H, Grace found herself thinking about the broader implications of everything that had happened. The confrontation with Blackwood had been about more than just her personal freedom. It had been about fundamental questions of justice, human dignity, and the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult or dangerous. Dr. Reynolds arrived just as they were loading James onto a makeshift stretcher for transport, his black medical bag in hand and his face grim with purpose. "I heard there was trouble," he said without preamble. "How is everyone?" "Physically, we're all fine," Grace reported. "But there were some threats made, and we're moving the Washington family to Circle H for safety." Dr. Reynolds nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. I brought something that might be useful." He reached into his bag and pulled out a sheaf of official-looking documents. "Legal papers declaring James Washington to be under my medical care as a patient recovering from serious injury. Anyone who interferes with his treatment or threatens his family will be violating territorial health codes, which carry significant penalties." Hayes examined the documents with obvious admiration. "Doc, you're sneakier than I gave you credit for. I've learned that sometimes you have to use the system's own rules against it when dealing with people like Blackwood," Dr. Reynolds replied. "Speaking of which, Grace, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding medical training. Given recent events, I think it might be wise to accelerate that timeline." Grace felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. "What do you mean? I'd like to start your formal medical education immediately. Not just basic nursing skills, but comprehensive training in diagnosis, treatment, surgery, even some veterinary medicine. This territory needs more qualified medical professionals, and you've shown both the aptitude and the character for the work." The offer was everything Grace could have hoped for. A path toward genuine professional independence, meaningful work that would help people, and skills that would make her valuable in any community. But it also meant change, challenge, and a level of responsibility she had never imagined possible. "What would that involve?" Hayes asked, clearly as interested in the proposal as Grace was. 3 years of intensive study and practical experience, Dr. Reynolds explained. "Grace would work with me during the day, learning everything from basic anatomy to complex surgical procedures. Evenings would be devoted to academic study, medical texts, chemistry, pharmacology. It's demanding work, but I believe she has the intellectual capacity to master it." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes at the casual assumption that she possessed intellectual capacity worth developing. For so long, her mind had been seen only as a potential source of trouble, too curious, too questioning, too independent. For a girl in her circumstances, the idea that someone would invest serious time and effort in developing her intellectual abilities was almost overwhelming. "There's one more thing," Dr. Reynolds continued. "I've been corresponding with a colleague in San Francisco who runs a small hospital there. If Grace completes her training successfully, there would be opportunities for her to work in a more sophisticated medical environment, gain experience with cases and procedures we never see out here in the desert." Hayes's expression grew thoughtful. "That would mean leaving Arizona." "Not permanently," Dr. Reynolds hastened to clarify. "The idea would be for Grace to spend a year or two gaining advanced experience, then return to establish her own practice here. This territory will need qualified medical professionals even more as it grows and develops." Grace looked between the two men, both of whom had played such crucial roles in her transformation from helpless victim to capable young woman. The path Dr. Reynolds was describing would give her everything she had never dared dream of: education, professional respect, financial independence, the ability to help people on a scale she had never imagined possible. But it would also mean separation from Hayes, from the Circle H, from the life they were just beginning to build together. The timing seemed almost cruelly ironic. Just as she and Hayes had acknowledged their feelings for each other, an opportunity was presenting itself that might require her to leave him behind. "You don't have to decide right now," Hayes said quietly, reading her internal conflict with the intuitive understanding that had developed between them. "This is your choice, Grace. Whatever you decide, I'll support you completely." "Even if it means I have to leave?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hayes took her hands in his expression serious but not sad. "Especially if it means you have to leave. Grace, I love you enough to want what's best for your future, even if that future doesn't include me. You have gifts, talents, intelligence that deserve to be developed to their fullest potential. If that means you need to go to San Francisco, then that's what you should do." Grace felt her heart breaking and soaring simultaneously. Hayes' willingness to sacrifice his own happiness for her development was exactly the kind of selfless love she had never expected to find. But it also confirmed what she had already begun to realize. She didn't want a future that didn't include him. "What if there was another way?" she asked. "What if I could get the training I need without leaving Arizona permanently?" Dr. Reynolds stroked his chin thoughtfully. "What did you have in mind?" "The training program you described. Could some of it be done through correspondence, books, written examinations, that kind of thing? And could you arrange for visiting physicians to come to the territory periodically to provide advanced instruction?" "It's possible," Dr. Reynolds said slowly. "Unconventional, but possible. It would take longer and you'd miss some of the benefits of working in a large hospital environment, but the basic medical education could certainly be accomplished that way. And," Grace continued, warming to her theme, "if Mr. Hayes is serious about expanding the Circle H to include vocational training, maybe medical training could be part of that program. Train young women to be nurses and midwives, young men to be medical assistants or veterinary technicians." Hayes stared at her with obvious admiration. "Grace, you're talking about establishing something like a medical college. That's an enormous undertaking." "So was rescuing me from my father's ranch," Grace replied with a smile. "So was standing up to Vincent Blackwood. So was offering to train carpenters and take in families who need protection. When has the size of an undertaking ever stopped you from doing what you thought was right?" Dr. Reynolds was nodding thoughtfully. "It's ambitious, but not impossible. There's definitely a need for more medical training opportunities in the Western Territories, and with the railroad expansion bringing more people to Arizona, the demand for qualified medical professionals will only increase." As the rain continued to fall around them, Grace felt the pieces of her future falling into place like a puzzle she had been working on without realizing it. The frightened girl who had been sold to pay gambling debts was gone forever, replaced by a woman with vision, purpose, and the courage to pursue both love and professional fulfillment on her own terms. "So what do you say, Dr. Reynolds?" Grace asked. "Would you be willing to help us establish the first medical training program in the Arizona Territory?" Dr. Reynolds smiled, and Grace could see the excitement building in his eyes. "Miss Sullivan, I think that's the best idea I've heard in 20 years of practicing medicine. When do we start?" As they made their way back toward the Circle H through the cleansing rain, Grace reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few short months. She had found safety, love, purpose, and now the prospect of a future that would allow her to combine all three in service of something larger than herself. The storm clouds were beginning to break up on the horizon, allowing shafts of golden sunlight to pierce through the gray. Grace took it as a good omen for everything that lay ahead. 2 years had passed since the confrontation at the Washington cabin, and the Circle H ranch had transformed into something none of them could have imagined that rainy day when everything changed. What had begun as a cattle operation had evolved into a thriving community center that drew visitors from across the territory and beyond. Grace stood on the porch of the new medical building, watching as the morning sun painted the expanded ranch in golden light. The sight never failed to fill her with wonder and pride. Where once there had been simple corrals and a modest ranch house, now stood a collection of well-designed buildings that housed not only the original cattle operation, but also a carpentry, school, a medical training facility, living quarters for students and faculty, and even a small library that had become the pride of the territorial education system. "Admiring your handiwork?" Jackson Hayes asked as he joined her on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the contented expression of a man who had found his life's work. "Our handiwork," Grace corrected, accepting the coffee gratefully. At 19, she had grown into a confident young woman whose reputation as a skilled healer extended far beyond the boundaries of Arizona territory. Her medical training under Dr. Reynolds had progressed so rapidly that she was now teaching basic nursing skills to other young women while continuing her own advanced studies through correspondence with physicians in San Francisco and Boston. "The new students arrived today," Hayes reminded her. 15 young women from 5 different territories, all coming here to learn medical skills. Are you ready to be the head instructor of the first female medical training program west of the Mississippi? Grace felt a familiar flutter of nervous excitement at the reminder. The program she had envisioned during that stormy confrontation 2 years ago had grown beyond her wildest dreams. Word had spread through medical circles about the innovative training being offered at the Circle H, and applications had poured in from young women across the West who hungered for the kind of opportunities Grace was providing. "I keep expecting to wake up and find this is all an elaborate dream," Grace admitted. "Sometimes I can't believe how far we've come from that night when you rescued me from my father's ranch." Hayes set down his coffee and took her hands in his, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the past 2 years. "We didn't come anywhere, Grace. You traveled this distance. I just provided a safe place for you to discover who you really were." The sound of approaching wagons interrupted their morning moment. Grace could see a dust cloud on the horizon that announced the arrival of the new students, along with their families and belongings. In a few hours, the ranch would be bustling with the organized chaos of orientation day. "Mrs. Hayes!" a voice called from the direction of the medical building. Grace turned to see Elizabeth Washington, James and Mary's eldest daughter, running toward them with the boundless energy of a 12-year-old who had grown up feeling completely safe and valued. "Mrs. Hayes, Papa says the new surgical instruments arrived from Chicago." Grace smiled at the title that still felt new and wonderful every time she heard it. She and Jackson had married 18 months ago in a ceremony that had been attended by half the territory, including territorial governor and several prominent physicians who had come to see the remarkable young woman whose work was revolutionizing medical care in the American West. "Thank you, Elizabeth. Would you please ask your father to inventory everything and make sure it matches the shipping manifest, and remind him that Dr. Reynolds will be here this afternoon to inspect the new equipment." Elizabeth nodded seriously, taking her responsibilities. As James Washington's assistant, with the gravity that came from being raised in an environment where every person's contributions were valued regardless of their age, gender, or background. As the girl ran back toward the medical building, Grace reflected on how the Washington family had become integral to the success of the Circle H's expanded mission. James had not only recovered fully from his injury, but had established himself as the most sought-after carpenter in the territory. His carpentry school had graduated nearly 40 young men who were now employed in construction projects throughout Arizona and New Mexico, Mary had become Grace's closest collaborator in developing the domestic science curriculum that was part of every female student's education, teaching practical skills alongside medical training. "Jackson," Grace said as they watched the approaching wagons, "do you ever regret how complicated our lives have become? Sometimes I wonder if you miss the simplicity of just running cattle." Hayes considered the question seriously, as he always did when Grace asked something important. "I miss the quiet sometimes," he admitted, "but Grace, what we've built here, it's not just about us anymore. Look around you. We have over 100 people living and working on this ranch. Students, instructors, families, support staff. Each one of them has a story, a reason they needed what we're offering. How could I regret providing opportunities that are changing people's lives?" Grace followed his gaze across the bustling community they had created. Near the carpentry workshops, she could see young men learning skills that would enable them to support families and build communities anywhere in the growing nation. In the gardens behind the main house, students in the agricultural program were experimenting with new irrigation techniques that could make farming viable in the desert climate. The medical building buzzed with activity as Dr. Reynolds and his assistant prepared for the day's instruction in anatomy and pharmacology. "Besides," Hayes continued with a grin, "someone has to keep you from taking on even more projects. I heard you talking to Dr. Reynolds yesterday about establishing a veterinary program." Grace laughed, recognizing the gentle teasing in his voice. "The territory needs trained veterinarians almost as much as it needs physicians. And the medical training the students receive here would provide an excellent foundation for veterinary work. See what I mean? Give you an inch, and you'll transform the entire American West single-handedly." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the first wagon, driven by a weathered man in his 50s with a teenage girl sitting beside him on the driver's bench. The girl looked nervous but determined, her eyes wide as she took in the scope of the Circle H operation. Grace and Jackson walked down to greet the new arrivals, a ritual they had established for every group of incoming students. Grace had learned that the first few hours at the ranch were crucial in helping nervous young women understand that they were entering a community that would support and challenge them in equal measure. "Welcome to the Circle H," Grace said warmly, as the man and girl climbed down from the wagon. "I'm Grace Hayes, and this is my husband Jackson. You must be Rebecca Morton from Colorado Territory." The girl nodded shyly. "Yes, ma'am. This is my father, Samuel Morton. He wasn't sure about letting me come so far from home for training." Samuel Morton removed his hat, revealing prematurely gray hair and eyes that spoke of hard experience. "Mrs. Hayes, I'll be honest with you. The idea of my daughter learning medical work still seems unnatural to me, but after what happened to my wife, if Rebecca had known more about childbirth complications, maybe Sarah would still be alive." Grace felt the familiar ache of sympathy for families torn apart by the lack of medical knowledge that was still too common in frontier communities. "Mr. Morton, I understand your concerns. When I started my medical training, there were many people who thought it was inappropriate for women to learn such things. But I've found that women often make exceptional medical practitioners because they're not afraid to be gentle and patient with people who are suffering." Over the next several hours, Grace and Jackson repeated this scene a dozen times as wagons arrived carrying young women from across the West. Each family had their own story, their own reasons for making the difficult decision to send a daughter hundreds of miles from home for training that was still considered unconventional, if not downright scandalous in many communities. There was Maria Santos, no relation to Maria, a young Mexican woman from New Mexico whose village desperately needed someone trained in basic medical care. Catherine O'Brien had traveled from Montana Territory after her brother was killed in a mining accident that might have been survivable with proper medical attention. Sarah Blackwood, she had pointedly kept her original surname despite being Vincent Blackwood's niece, had defied her entire family to pursue medical training that she saw as a way to atone for her uncle's cruelties. As Grace listened to each story, she was reminded of her own journey from desperate victim to confident healer. These young women were taking the same leap of faith she had taken, trusting that education and skill could transform their lives and enable them to transform others. The afternoon brought the arrival of Dr. Reynolds, along with 2 visiting physicians from San Francisco, who had come to observe the Circle H program and potentially establish similar training opportunities in California. Grace felt a familiar nervousness as she prepared to demonstrate the teaching methods and curriculum that had evolved over 2 years of trial and error. "Gentlemen," she began as she led them into the medical building's main classroom, "what you're about to see represents our philosophy that medical training should be both theoretical and practical from the very beginning. Rather than spending months on pure anatomy study, our students begin working with actual patients under close supervision from their first week here." The classroom was equipped with anatomical models, surgical instruments, and even a small library of medical texts that represented a significant investment in the most current medical knowledge available. But the real innovation was the adjoining clinic, where students gained hands-on experience treating everything from minor injuries to serious illnesses under the guidance of qualified physicians. "This is remarkable," said Dr. William Porter from San Francisco. "Most medical schools don't provide this level of practical experience until the final year of study. You're essentially creating physician's assistants with capabilities that rival many formally trained doctors." Grace led them to the clinic, where several advanced students were working under Dr. Reynolds' supervision. Rebecca Washington, James and Mary's middle daughter, was carefully suturing a ranch hand's lacerated arm while explaining her technique to 2 newer students. Her work was precise and confident, her manner with the patient both professional and reassuring. "How long has Miss Washington been training?" asked Dr. Charles Harrison from the San Francisco General Hospital. 18 months, Grace replied. "She's one of our most promising students. Her combination of manual dexterity and natural empathy makes her exceptionally skilled at both surgical procedures and patient care." Dr. Harrison watched Rebecca complete the suturing with obvious admiration. "Mrs. Hayes, I'll be frank with you. What I'm seeing here challenges everything I thought I knew about medical education. Your students are demonstrating competencies that typically take 3 years to develop in traditional medical schools." Grace felt a surge of pride, not just in her students, but in the validation of the educational philosophy that had driven the program's development. "Dr. Harrison, we found that when students understand from the beginning that their training has immediate practical applications, they learn faster and retain more. They're not just memorizing information for examinations. They're acquiring skills they use every day to help real people with real problems." The tour continued through the pharmacy, where students learned to compound medications, the laboratory, where they practiced microscopic analysis and basic chemistry, and the library, where they engaged in independent research projects under faculty guidance. "The scope of this program is extraordinary," Dr. Porter observed. "You're providing more comprehensive medical education than most institutions in major cities. How do you fund such an ambitious operation?" Jackson stepped forward to answer. "The ranch's cattle and agricultural operations provide the foundation, but we've also established partnerships with territorial governments and medical institutions that help support the program. Students pay modest tuition when they can afford it, but we never turn away qualified applicants due to financial limitations. More importantly," Grace added, Many of our graduates stay in the territory to practice, which creates a network of trained medical professionals who continue to support and learn from each other. We're not just training individual practitioners, we're building a medical community. As the evening approached, Grace found herself standing once again on the porch of the medical building, this time watching as the new students settled into their dormitory rooms and began the process of forming the relationships that would sustain them through the challenging months ahead. Jackson joined her, as she had known he would, carrying the evening coffee that had become their daily ritual. "So what did you think of our visiting doctors?" "I think they were impressed," Grace replied. "Dr. Harrison mentioned the possibility of establishing formal partnerships between our program and San Francisco General. That could open up even more opportunities for our graduates and more complications for us," Jackson observed wryly. "Success seems to breed more success, which breeds more responsibility." Grace laughed, recognizing the truth in his words. The Circle H's reputation had grown to the point where they received inquiries almost daily from individuals and institutions wanting to visit, study, partner, or replicate what they had built. Managing all these relationships while maintaining the quality of their core programs required constant attention and energy. "Jackson," Grace said seriously, "do you think we're trying to do too much? Are we in danger of losing focus on what really matters?" Hayes considered the question while watching the lights come on in windows across the ranch complex. "What really matters to you, Grace? What is it that makes all this worthwhile?" Grace followed his gaze, thinking about the young women who had arrived that day, each carrying hopes and dreams that the training they received here would enable them to build meaningful lives and serve their communities. She thought about Rebecca Washington's steady hands, suturing a wound, about Maria Santos learning to compound medications that could save lives, about Sarah Blackwood finding purpose in healing rather than the cruelty her family name had come to represent. "Seeing people discover they're capable of more than they ever imagined," she said finally. "Giving them the tools to take control of their own futures and help others do the same. Creating something that will continue to make a difference long after we're gone." "Then we're not doing too much," Hayes replied. "We're doing exactly what we should be doing." As if summoned by their conversation, footsteps approached across the porch. They turned to see Dr. Reynolds emerging from the medical building, his face showing the satisfied exhaustion of a man who had spent the day doing work he loved. "Grace, Jackson," he said, settling into one of the porch chairs with a grateful sigh. "I wanted to thank you both before I head back to town. Today was extraordinary. Watching those young women work, seeing the confidence and competence they've developed under your guidance. You've created something truly special here. We couldn't have done any of this without your support and expertise," Grace replied. "You took a chance on an untrained girl who wanted to learn healing, and you made all of this possible." Dr. Reynolds shook his head. "Grace, I may have provided some technical knowledge, but the vision for this place, the determination to make it succeed, the ability to inspire others to pursue excellence, that all came from you. And you, Jackson, for having the wisdom to recognize Grace's potential and the courage to support her dreams, even when they meant major changes to your own life." As the three of them sat in comfortable silence, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years ago, she had been a frightened girl being sold to pay her father's debts. Tonight, she was a respected educator whose program was attracting attention from medical institutions across the country. But perhaps more importantly, she had learned that true freedom wasn't just about escaping bad circumstances. It was about using that freedom to create opportunities for others who were still trapped in situations she had escaped. Every young woman who graduated from the Circle H program and went on to provide medical care in underserved communities was, in a sense, a continuation of Grace's own rescue and transformation. "What's next?" Dr. Reynolds asked, breaking the contemplative silence. I have a feeling you two aren't content to simply maintain what you've already built. Grace and Jackson exchanged a look that spoke of shared dreams and mutual understanding. We've been talking about expanding the program to include training for men as well, Grace said. There's no reason why the techniques we've developed couldn't be applied to training male medical assistants and nurses, and we're considering establishing satellite programs in other territories, Jackson added. Send experienced instructors to set up smaller versions of what we've built here, adapted to local needs and conditions. Dr. Reynolds smiled knowingly. In other words, you're planning to revolutionize medical education throughout the American West. Is that too ambitious? Grace asked, suddenly uncertain. My dear girl, Dr. Reynolds replied, 2 years ago you were asking if it was too ambitious to get basic medical training while living on a cattle ranch. Look around you. Ambition, properly applied, seems to be your specialty. As the stars began to appear in the desert sky, Grace felt a deep sense of contentment settling over her. She had found love, purpose, and the means to make a lasting difference in the world. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned that the greatest victories were not personal triumphs, but collective achievements that lifted entire communities. The frightened girl who had been sold like cattle was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had discovered that true strength came not from avoiding difficulties, but from facing them with courage, intelligence, and the support of people who believed in your potential. The Circle H Ranch would continue to grow and evolve, but its core mission would remain the same, providing opportunities for people to discover their own capabilities and use them in service of something larger than themselves. It was, Grace realized, the perfect memorial to the suffering she had endured and the love that had saved her. As she and Jackson made their way inside to prepare for another day of teaching, learning, and building the future they envisioned, Grace whispered, a prayer of gratitude for the chain of events that had brought her to this place and these people. Sometimes salvation came in unexpected forms. Sometimes it took the shape of a stranger riding out of the desert darkness, offering hope when hope seemed impossible. And sometimes, if you were very fortunate, that salvation grew into something beautiful enough to save others in return. Uppy. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.